And we are live.
All right, good. This is a continuation of Senate Health and Welfare, March 15th, and we are moving to S25, an act relating to regulating cosmetic and menstrual products containing certain chemicals and chemical classes in textiles and athletic turf fields containing PFAs. So this is a bill that we have been through previously, and today we have an opportunity to gather additional testimony. But we also have taken some initial testimony on the bill. Marcy Gallagher is late because of the weather, which is, oh, there you are. I didn't see you come in. Okay, Marcy, you are here. And I think you have submitted something for us on our webpage. So why don't you come up and help us understand the chemicals, please?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sorry about my delay. The alerts were quite bad, but for the record, Marcy Gallagher, I'm the environmental advocate with BFERG, and you all heard from me a couple weeks ago up on the screen. But I did just want to share some documents that I put together that I think should help make these chemicals on this list a little less intimidating, because I know most of us haven't heard of most of these chemicals or what they actually mean. So Alex, is it easier for me to share my screen, or?
Yeah, if you just join the Zoom, I can give you that.
Is this an updated edition from the one that you sent to me?
I have the one that I sent to you, and also one additional one that shares some recommendations that we would make on the chemicals.
And they should both be posted.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the original list of chemicals in this document. I think some of you have seen. So what I did here was break these out into a few different categories. These chemicals, whether they've had action taken in Vermont already. So a lot of these chemicals, for example, are on the chemicals of high concern to children list. I'll get into that a little bit more. Whether they've been banned already by the EU or by Canada, whether they've been banned or have taken action in other states, and whether there's major retailers, some of the big ones are CVS, Target, Walmart, Walgreens, Whole Foods, and whether those have banned or restricted these chemicals.
So the retailers are ahead of the federal government and the state government.
The retailers are really ahead, yes.
That's good to hear.
So I actually broke out the class of phthalates. So each of these chemicals are now listed separately, but this is in this colored section. These are all under the orthophthalates category. They are all on the list of chemicals of high concern to children.
Okay.
And won't go through each of these chemicals, but just to demonstrate that these all have had action taken somewhere else. But I will move to the second list, which was, recognizing that this committee has just a few days to take on this really important piece of legislation, and understanding that you may want to pass a list of chemicals that has the most support possible. We thought if you were to restrict the list, we would like to propose that you do it under a few categories. So pick the chemicals that are already in this bill that are covered by the list of chemicals of high concern to children. And so these chemicals were acted upon by the legislature back in 2014, acknowledging that they do pose really severe risk to children's health, either by being a carcinogen or toxic to the immune system or the reproductive system. They affect hormones, they can be severe skin allergens, etc. So these were acted on already determined by the legislature to be of high threat and are required to be reported on by manufacturers when used in children's products. The Department of Health also has the ability to regulate them in these products, but as we know, the Department of Health has had their hands tied over the last several years. So we do have the opportunity to just ban these chemicals from personal care products that we know kids are using every day as well as adults: sunscreen, lotion, shampoo, Harry Kangler, the list goes on. So we'd recommend that you do take action on all of these chemicals on the list of high concern to children, as well as chemicals that have already been banned by other states. California and Maryland have banned a number of these chemicals, and Washington is proposing to ban several more. They've passed this bill through their House. It's currently moving through their Senate. The chances look good for that. So those are the categories. The list of chemicals of high concern to children, the chemicals that have been banned by California and Maryland rather, and what's proposed to be banned in Washington. And just to show you, so these blue chemicals are what would be included under those categories, and then the orange is what would not be included. So we wouldn't be including all of the parabens that are currently on the list, just a few. We wouldn't be including some of these chemicals. But overall, it is still a good number of chemicals in this list, and we do feel that this would still be very protective.
So you're excluding the orange,
Exactly, yeah.
or suggesting that if we wanted to move forward more in a more expeditious way, that might be a way to go. I mean, I'm also looking at all of the retailers who are including those, so.
Right,
Yeah.
you know, I do feel that all of these chemicals on this list were already thoughtfully chosen because they had been restricted heavily elsewhere. But if you did want to move forward with a maybe simpler list, I think this would be a good model.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for doing that triage.
Yeah. One other comment just on the textiles piece is that, as far as I know, this textiles language is really intended to model California's, but there are a few pieces that are missing that are in California's language. So I just wanted to acknowledge those and say that we're supportive of including those. We don't have a problem with this.
Which ones?
There's an exemption for gear for severe weather conditions. That gives an extra 3 years for them to ban PFAS. There's also a threshold for contaminant levels. That's 100 parts per million for PFAS that are not intentionally added but show up as contaminants. Those are the two that I'm aware of.
Can you send us in writing?
Yes.
That'd be helpful. Yeah, good. Okay, so that is not in our bill, but it's in the California. They have severe weather out there. Yeah. Maybe this is normal.
It's not.
Not when you're outside.
Okay, questions committee. It's a lot. It's a long list, but it's also, I think you have given us some things that might help move us forward on the bill. Excuse me, thank you. Questions for Marcy? Okay, and this is the new edition with the color code. It's, you know.
Both of them were submitted.
Yeah, I have the old one. I don't have a new one. All right, and so we have the bill. We understand that there are different elements in the bill: the personal care products, textiles, menstrual products, and athletic turf. I sort of, if we can frame it that way, that helps us think about the bill. And as we hear testimony, I think folks will be focusing on more and more of those areas, perhaps individual chemicals, we'll see. So Janet Noodleman is here with the personal care products. You are here online. Thank you. And what we'll do is I'll have the committee introduce themselves, and then I'll have you, for everyone who's here with us, and then I'll have you introduce yourself for the record and give us your testimony. So start with you, Senator Gulick.
Hello, Senator Gulick from Chittenden Central District.
Good morning, Dave Weeks, Rutland County.
Senator Ginny Lyons representing Chittenden Southeast.
Terry Williams representing Rutland County.
Morning, Ruth Hardy from Addison District.
Okay. All right, thank you for being here. Why don't you go right ahead?
Good morning, and thank you all for this opportunity to testify in support of S25. I'm calling in this morning from not so sunny Oakland, California, where we have been experiencing atmospheric rains over the past week. Not so much the snow that you get in the great state of Vermont, but a lot of rain. So, and I think your conditions are just as tough as ours are here in California in terms of the textile ban. So thank you for that. My name is Janet Noodleman, and I'm the Senior Director of Program and Policy at Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. We are the only national organization solely focused on preventing breast cancer by identifying and eliminating the environmental links to the disease. And I am also the director of BCPP's Campaign for Safe Cosmetics, where I've been working for the past 20 years to strengthen the safety and the transparency of the over 10,000 chemicals that are used to formulate the beauty and personal care products that we use as consumers every day. And although S25 would ban harmful chemicals from artificial turf, period products, and cosmetic products, I will only be discussing cosmetic safety today, which is my personal area of expertise. So why is S25 so important? The body of scientific evidence is undisputed and growing as to the harm to human health caused by the chemicals that would be banned by S25, including breast and other cancers, birth defects, damage to the reproductive system, organ system toxicity, and endocrine disruption. In the United States, breast cancer and a host of other chronic diseases and conditions have been steadily increasing over the past 50 years and are being linked to the chemicals we are exposed to in beauty and personal care and other consumer products through our workplaces and through our communities. The Trade Association for the Conventional Cosmetics Industry argues that a little bit of a toxic chemical in a consumer product isn't a cause for concern. The old adage, the dose makes the poison, but this is simply not true. Science tells us that for hormonally active chemicals that are banned by this bill, even small exposures at parts per million or even parts per billion, which is the equivalency of a drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, that these exposures can be biologically active and cause harm to human health, especially to the health of developing fetuses, infants, and children. And similar to the endocrine disrupting compounds that would be banned by this bill, many scientists believe that there is no safe level of exposure to a carcinogen, to a cancer-causing chemical. And S25 would ban a host of cancer-causing chemicals as well. So importantly, when we talk about chemical exposures, we are never talking about single isolated incidents. From the minute we wake up in the morning until the moment we go to bed at night, every one of us is exposed to a cocktail of toxic chemicals, and the science is telling us that the timing, the mixtures, and our cumulative exposure to these unsafe chemicals are adding up to harm. Children are far more vulnerable to hormonally active chemicals and carcinogens than adults, and early life exposures to endocrine disrupting compounds can put children on the road to early puberty or an increased risk of breast cancer and other diseases later in life. Other vulnerable populations who are regularly exposed and often overexposed to many of the chemicals that would be banned by S25 include Black women and other women of color. So similarly important is S25's class-based approach to banning unsafe chemical ingredients. And I know witnesses today will speak to other classes that are banned by this bill, but I want to speak to the class of formaldehyde releasing agents. And that's because opponents to this bill's ban of the class of formaldehyde releasing agents argue that these chemicals are not the equivalent to formaldehyde, which simply isn't true, because the primary role of this class of chemicals is quite literally to release small amounts of formaldehyde over time in order to preserve the product. Yet, this is a problem because formaldehyde is known to be a human carcinogen by many expert scientific and governmental bodies. An alarming report issued in January of 2023 by the Washington State Department of Ecology found formaldehyde levels ranging from an estimate of 39.2 parts per million to 1,660 parts per million in 30 cosmetic products it tested that listed a formaldehyde releasing agent on the product level. Levels of formaldehyde as low as 200 parts per million are known to cause serious allergic reactions in individuals who are sensitive to formaldehyde. And the Washington product testing detected 200 parts per million of formaldehyde in over 80% of the products that the agency tested. So a lot of formaldehyde in the majority of these products at very high levels, known to cause serious allergic reactions, and also known to be linked to breast cancer. To all cancers. So federal inaction regarding the well-documented harmful effects of cosmetic chemicals on human health is alarming, and it illustrates the need for Vermont leadership in this regard. Over the 80-year history of regulating cosmetic safety, the FDA has only ever banned or restricted the use of 11 chemicals from cosmetics. That's out of the 10,000 chemicals that are used, the majority of which are industrial chemicals, and in stark contrast to the European Union, which has banned over 1,800 chemicals from cosmetic products linked to cancer, mutagenicity, or reproductive harm. The Federal Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act of 2022, referred to as MOCRA, was signed into law by President Biden this past December. And it was the first federal law to significantly update the FDA oversight of the $100 billion cosmetics industry in over 80 years. However, this new law, although it does many good things, did not create a system for FDA pre-market safety testing of chemicals in cosmetics, and instead left the responsibility for banning or restricting chemicals in cosmetics to the states. Furthermore, MOCRA left in place gaps in cosmetic safety that impact everyone, but particularly women of color. Another reason why passing S25 is so important. There's one key thought that I really hope to leave with you today, and that's the importance of S25 going further than the high bar for ingredient safety that was established in 2020 by the enactment of the California Toxic-Free Cosmetics Act, which was a bill that my organization co-sponsored and worked on. The 2020 California legislation banned 24 toxic chemicals from cosmetic products sold in our state and was a historic first ever bill, but now more is needed. Vermont has the opportunity to build on what we were able to do in California, raise an even higher bar for ingredient safety, and become the state with the most health protective cosmetic safety framework in the country. In conclusion, I'm here today to say the stakes couldn't be higher, especially for the 1 in 8 women who will experience breast cancer in her lifetime. This is an important bill that takes us one step closer to preventing breast cancer before it starts by removing a major source of women's ongoing exposure to some of the most toxic substances on the planet. Thank you for your time this morning, and I urge you respectfully to support S25.
Thank you. Do you have your testimony in writing that you could please send to us so we have it on our webpage?
It's been posted.
It's been posted now. Oh, good. It wasn't there earlier. Thank you. Questions committee? We're good? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And good luck with your weather.
Thank you. And you with yours.
All right. All right. So we're going to move on to Kelsey Johnson, who is Vice President of State and State Governor. Are you here? Is Kelsey here? There you are. Welcome.
Hi there. Thank you. I'm actually calling in from Washington State as well. So also dealing with a little bit of rain in this area. So good morning, Chair Lyons and members of the committee, my name is Kelsey Johnson, and I am Vice President of State Government Affairs for the Personal Care Products Council. I am pleased to be here today to comment on Senate Bill 25. On behalf of the members of the Personal Care Products Council, or PCPC for short, I want to thank you for your interest in safe cosmetics. We recognize your concerns and want to work with you to achieve your intent. Our members work every day to ensure the safety of their products and the satisfaction of their customers. That said, we do have some concerns with some parts of the bill. In general, we are here to support a version of the bill that matches the recent law enacted on this topic in California. In my testimony, I will provide an overview of our organization, talk about the industry's commitment to safe consumer products, summarize a recent new federal regulatory law, and then explain why a Vermont law mimicking the recent California law makes sense. The Personal Care Products Council is a leading national trade association representing cosmetics and personal care product companies and serving as the voice on scientific, legal, regulatory, legislative, and international issues for the global cosmetics industry. The personal care products industry holds sacred the trust families put into the safety of their products. Our member companies invest substantial resources in scientific research and safety processes to ensure we are precisely following all laws and regulations and providing safe products to our consumers. PCPC and its member companies have a long history of going above and beyond what is required by law and a long history of working with various stakeholders at all levels of government on public policy. Thank you for your time today. I'd like to update you on the important federal recent development that you heard about already. President Biden recently signed the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act of 2022, or MOCRA. It was included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 that was signed into law by President Biden on December 29th of 2022. PCPC applauds Congress for spearheading the effort on cosmetics modernization and thanks bipartisan members of Congress and the administration for working together to modernize federal regulatory oversight of cosmetics and personal care products marketed in the US. This long-awaited historic legislation gives the FDA additional tools to ensure the safety of cosmetics, protects consumers, and reinforces consumer confidence in the products they trust and enjoy every day. MOCRA represents significant reform of FDA's cosmetics authority, which was signed into law by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. MOCRA also brings the FDA's oversight of the beauty and personal care industry more in line with other categories the agency regulates and contributes to the global regulatory alignment. We ask that you pause on further state action as implementation begins on this historic law. Senate Bill 25 does not harmonize with other recently enacted state laws. Cosmetics and personal care products companies remain committed to advancing innovative product technologies that address a wide variety of consumer needs. If the legislature moves forward with Senate Bill 25, PCPC respectfully requests amendments to harmonize with other recently enacted state laws. For example, California's Assembly Bill 2771 was signed by Governor Newsom in September of 2022 and phases out PFAS in cosmetics. California's Assembly Bill 2771 builds upon California's Assembly Bill 2762, which was signed into law by Governor Newsom in 2021, which bans certain cosmetic and personal care ingredients, harmonizes with ingredient restrictions in the European Union, and was supported by a wide group of stakeholders, including the Personal Care Products Council. Again, PCPC is seeking amendments to provide regulatory certainty and international harmonization. Our specific concerns with Senate Bill 2025 as currently drafted are to please remove the reference to formaldehyde-releasing agents. FRAs are an important preservative. We call them time-release preservative that is not equivalent to formaldehyde. These time-release preservatives are not formaldehyde and do not present the concerns associated with breathing formaldehyde. These time-release preservatives safely and effectively protect consumer personal care products against microbial contamination which can harm consumers by causing infection. PCPC requests the legislation include definition of ingredient consistent with California and federal law. PCPC requests the addition of language around technically unavoidable trace quantities consistent with California law. Failure to include this could result in manufacturers being held liable for trace contaminants found ubiquitously in the environment, such as soil and water. PCPC opposes the inclusion of orthophthalates, and PCPC opposes the inclusion of p-phenylenediamine, as well as a number of other ingredients, as was kind of alluded to by earlier testimony, that are not included in any other state bans. For all the reasons I've outlined today, PCPC respectfully asks that you amend Senate Bill 25 to align with California's cosmetic consumer protection law. We welcome the opportunity to dialogue with you on the legislation, and thank you for your consideration and opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was exactly what the type of testimony we were looking for. It was very succinct and direct to the bill. So we appreciate that.
Sure thing.
Questions committee. So it will be helpful to have your testimony in writing. If you can get it to Alex, and we'll have
Absolutely.
it on the committee webpage. So I do have
Happy
a
to do
question.
that.
Yeah, I do have a question. I mean, you referenced California significantly. I know that you're in Washington State right now, and there is a bill going through there, going through the final process there. And Maryland has also acted on some of the chemicals that we're looking at. So Maryland has already passed some of that. And then some of these chemicals are being excluded from retail sales by individual retailers.
Yes.
Can you just speak to some of those issues?
Yeah, and actually I'll add that into my testimony too, so that you have that in documentation. But there are a number of retail partners that are excluding different chemicals and different ingredients in cosmetics and personal care products. However, I would point that none of them are banning entire classes. And often if they are banning ingredients, they are using CAS numbers to align to ensure that the personal care products and cosmetic companies can easily detect whether or not those ingredients are included in their formulations. Also, I would just say that none of them, not any retail partner, not any state or the EU, have gone out of their way to ban formaldehyde releasing agents or those time release preservatives that I was just alluding to.
Okay, thank you. Anything you include will be helpful.
Absolutely, happy to do that.
I won't ask my other question. I'll save that for later. It's more of a comment. I know that since 1938, FDA has banned 11 chemicals out of how many hundreds of thousands. So it's disconcerting to think that FDA might begin to acting a little faster, but that's another day, another discussion about how that all works. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, so Bill Driscoll is here, and you thought you would never be back. We're glad you're
Things have
here.
finally been restored. Natural order here, Madam Chair.
Thank you for being here.
I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad to be back. For the record, William Driscoll with Associated Industries Vermont. We represent primarily the manufacturing sector in the state. And I'll try to keep my comments very general in terms of the approach to this bill. We've been in numerous discussions with industry groups that represent more directly the sectors and products that are addressed in this bill. And I think they can speak to the more detailed substance in terms of issues and recommendations. I would just start out, I mean, it's very, very obvious and very well known by everybody in this room that obviously there's been growing attention both from government and also industry in addressing concerns with certain chemicals over the years. PFAS is certainly the most high profile example of that trend. And I think in trying to move away from chemicals in industry. There are important practical considerations that they have to deal with. The central thing is finding both a safe but also an effective alternative to these chemicals. And that involves trying to identify those prospects, addressing issues with reformulation or redesign of products. Sometimes you have to make changes to the manufacturing process. And then there's also the challenge, which varies from product to product, of how do you responsibly deal with the transition of existing inventory in the stockpiles. And there's various ways to do all those things. But when it comes to applying laws or regulation to these issues, we would submit that it is important to try to take these factors into consideration. That involves being appropriate with either timeframes to accomplish these various things, or having a step-by-step process. There are some regulations that require the identification of safe alternatives first, and then you go to the next step and the next step. Or you can just try to pick a time frame that people agree is probably enough to accomplish that process. Clear definitions and standards, appropriate scope and prioritization of chemicals. And I think these are all issues with this legislation. And I think it's important to maybe keep in mind what has been happening in Maine last couple of years, where they maybe have gotten ahead of themselves in terms of the timeframes they have set up and the requirements on manufacturers. And there's been some difficulty in trying to comply appropriately. So that's just sort of a real world example of what can happen if you don't get this right. But in talking to the groups that represent the more specific industries, with the Personal Care Products Council, the Fragrance Creators Association, obviously has heard from Kelsey on their recommendations. I know you'll be hearing from the baby and adult hygiene products folks. I think you have a recommendation in writing from the Household and Commercial Products Association. They all have input on Section 1. And then obviously, I think you'll be hearing from the American Apparel and Footwear Association, Outdoor Industry Association, the Vermont Outdoor Business Association, who have recommendations on the textiles. And I have been speaking with the synthetic turf section is a little bit more uncertain ground. I have had some initial talks with the synthetic turf council, and there's a recycled rubber coalition. And this is a little bit more new to them. I don't think that they may not have specific recommendations to make, but I would put forward, I think it would be reasonable to consider moving the effective date of that section, just because it's literally this July. And that really may not be enough time for them to try to grapple with this issue and try to find a way to how to appropriately comply with or even respond to the ban. So that's not, I'm not speaking on their behalf for that, but that would be an observation. I think that would be reasonable to do. Maybe syncing up with 2026, like the other sections, or something else, just to allow them to, try to find their way through this process and maybe provide more meaningful feedback to you folks going forward. So I would really, so again, I would defer to what you have just heard on Section 1, and what I know you'll be hearing on the following section. I just think it's fair and reasonable and appropriate to try to both sync up to large markets like California, but also adopt either scope or timeframes that are achievable for industries that are trying to get to the same place that you would like to move things. I would just want to also comment though on the proposal as I understood it earlier today, about taking chemicals from the list of chemicals of high concern to children program and translating that or applying that as a ban of those chemicals in any particular product category. I'll certainly defer to those groups that represent cosmetics and personal and hygiene products if they want to speak to those specifically. But I would just observe that the chemicals of high concern to children statute, the reporting mechanism, and all that, that is a reporting mechanism. This report of the chemicals being present in products. And I think the very important thing about that that law, as you know, Madam Chair, we go back many years on that law. It is not an indication of safety of any of those products, because the reporting is simply the presence of that chemical. It has nothing to do with the amount of that chemical or the exposure pathways or any of the risks that might be associated with those products. So to simply take that list and say, well, we'll just simply ban everything on that list in, again, whether it's cosmetics or any other product category, is not at all sort of a scientific approach or really a reasonable or rational approach. Now, the committee may well have an interest in investigating the safety of any of those chemicals in any particular products. That's perfectly legitimate subject matter, but that is not what this proposal, as I understood it, would be. And that is certainly not something that can be rationally accomplished in any sort of appropriate way in like the next few days of this week, for sure.
Thank you. Yeah. good
Can I ask
comments.
a question? Yeah. Is around turf fields, I'm
Mhm.
asking this because we're voting on one in Burlington tonight, I think. Is there such a thing as a chemical-free turf fields? And what are states like California doing around that?
Well, okay, so I'm not the expert, but
Yeah,
based
I
on the
know.
conversations I've had, I mean, obviously, well, first of all, everything is chemicals, but you know, to the extent that the kind of products
Chemical-free.
that, yeah, I think part of the issue, and this is some of the things that are going on in Maine, is, you know, to the extent that for, you know, specifically PFAS, I think determining the prevalence or the prevalence and use of PFAS in those products, I think that's a little bit challenging in part because it's certainly, and I think this is some of the concerns in terms of enforcement and compliance, by their very nature of being out there in the fields, there's so much environmental PFAS contamination that trying to figure out what's environmental, what's product can be challenging. Also, they're
Well, you're talking about the fields that are already
The
down.
fields, yeah. And again, I'm extrapolating from conversations with these folks, but you know, to the extent that a lot of it is made out of recycled products, you find the same issue with recycled paper products too. When you're manufacturing things from recycled products, the whole challenge of figuring out how do you fit PFAS or other chemicals that might be in that raw material into what's reasonable, responsible for the manufacturer using that material, and that's, you know, that's challenging too. And so and I think that's another reason why maybe we need time to really figure out what the best approach to that particular topic is.
But it sounds
but-
like there are several different issues embedded in what you're saying, but they're all very important.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
and so we're not suggesting, well,
I
as
mean,
a
if you
practical,
know, I mean, for example, and then we're probably gonna have to move on, but you
Sure.
know, for example, if you know that a turf field is being laid down and it does have PFAS on it, that may not be the best thing to do for the players. And I'm thinking about the recent article about the Philadelphia Phillies baseball team, where they had a high incidence of death, cancer related to PFAS. And so that, you know, so we want to prevent that from happening. At the same time, if it's a field that's already there, then you need to figure out how much was environmental. And so, and then recycling all this stuff, whole nother set of issues. Oh, we're going to be having you in here a lot.
are we making up for lost time then?
Yeah, so one more question, Senator Weeks.
So you made a comment about the transition from where we are now to where we want to be related to this bill. But I'm wondering if you have specifics, like in the draft bill, or specific pages, line items where the date needs to be, from your perspective, updated.
Yeah, and we are deferring to and supporting the recommendations that you're going to get from the specific impacted
Okay,
sectors.
very good.
So for what you just heard on section 1, we support that, and what you're going to hear on the next one, we would support that.
Okay.
Just
Senator-
quickly, you talked about problems you're having in Maine. Do we have access to that, any of that information?
I think we may hear about that, right? And
That
we'll-
might be a fun week for you to
Yeah.
discuss that.
And then we'll also be hearing from the Department of Health, and that relates very much to the chemicals of high concern children and others. So there will we'll continue to get our testimony. And if you can send yours in, that would be helpful.
Sure.
That'd be great. Okay, thank you. Kelly Alt. Kelly Alt. I knew I recognized her. I was confusing you with a representative and I said, no. Yeah. Okay, thank you for being here.
Well, hello. For the record, I'm Kelly Alt, Executive Director of the Vermont Outdoor Business Alliance. Thank you for having me here today on this very snowy day, which illustrates the need for outdoor apparel and accessories
Very
for us
appropriate.
hardy Vermonters, as well as others who enjoy being in the outdoors, having to navigate the outdoors. Chair Lyons, Vice Chair Weeks, and committee, I appreciate the opportunity to speak today in support of S25 on behalf of the outdoor businesses that we represent. VOBA is a statewide nonprofit organization established in 2018, representing over 100 outdoor businesses across the state, dedicated to strengthening the outdoor economy here in Vermont. And our work in networking, education, and policy advocacy focuses on advancing solutions for some of the challenges in business and workforce development, as well as giving back to our local communities, the natural landscapes, and supporting equitable access to the outdoors. Overall, the U.S. and Vermont textile and apparel industry is committed to transitioning to non-fluorinated materials and has been making significant investments in new material research and development. They have been making adjustments to the supply chain and investing corporate resources to remove intentionally added PFAS from their products. And they've been doing for many years and are very committed to the process. We believe the changes that we recommend today that are in my testimony and that I'll review here.
We have it.
Yes, great. Will strengthen the ability of Vermont's manufacturers and retailers to comply with the new requirements in a predictable way, that they're achievable, and it also can prevent unintended negative consequences economically, especially for the small businesses and selling out inventory was mentioned earlier. The changes to Section 3 of S25 would provide clarity in definitions and requirements, consistency with regulations in other states, specifically California's AB 1819, which has been referenced, and adequate timelines, which has also been referenced. And I'll get to some of those details that you requested for manufacturers to accommodate the lengthy production cycles, which sometimes can be upwards of 36 months. For them to be able to prevent supply chain disruption and avoid the introduction of regrettable alternatives, as well as retailers being able to ensure the ability to sell out inventory and minimize the economic hardship. These timelines are critical. Our letter, my testimony is online. There's also a letter that was jointly submitted with other national outdoor and apparel associations. So not only am I bringing forward some Vermont input, but also it's aligned with where the industry has been landing in coalition work, in collaboration work in other states. The American Apparel and Footwear Association, of which you'll hear from, has been involved, in some of those more national conversations and other bills. So if there are questions I can't answer, hopefully Chelsea will be able to answer, or we'll be able to get answers for you. The first recommendation is to expand that definition of intentionally added to mean that the addition of PFAS substances have a functional and technical effect in the product, and that distinguishes it from the environmental contamination that we've talked about. Additionally, as part of a definition, a clear delineation of what is considered intentionally added is a testing threshold level, and 100 parts per million of total organic fluorine mirrors what is in the initial requirement in the California law, and that is identified as being reliable and provides the science-based approach. The second recommendation is to use a widely accepted definition of outdoor apparel for severe wet conditions. And we'll get to an expanded timeline on this category later in the testimony, but specifically we wanted it in there and to define this type of outdoor apparel as extreme and extended use products designed for outdoor sports experts for applications that provide protection against extended exposure to extreme rain conditions, or against extended immersion in water or wet conditions such as from snow in order to protect the health and safety of the user and that are not marketed for general consumer use. Moving to another recommendation in the description of prohibition of textiles in 1692A, we recommend replacing in any amount with language that applies to products purchased by a brand or retailer after the effective date. Moving on to another recommendation regarding the certificate of compliance, we recommend increasing the 30-day response window to 60 days so manufacturers have adequate time to provide the requested information by the Attorney General. This is important considering the requirements are unknown at this point, and so if there is something like testing involved, it allows manufacturers to find a testing lab, which can be challenging, and allows that process to go to completion in time to comply with the request. And rulemaking, there is a proposal for 12 months between the adoption of the rules and Section 3 going into effect. Again, this gap ensures that companies can plan ahead, knowing what is expected of them, and therefore be in compliance with the law and not have to deal with a situation where they can't be in compliance because they want to be in compliance. And then finally, we recommend the changes to the effective dates for Section 3 for ski wax apparel and outdoor apparel, January 1, 2026 is achievable. And this gives important time for production cycles and what is involved in switching to alternative chemistry and allows for not just the big manufacturers, but the small manufacturers to comply with the law. Additionally, similar to California, where timelines were agreed upon by environmental organizations and the industry, we recommend that PFAS in outdoor apparel for severe wet conditions be prohibited starting in January 1st, 2028. In summary, we appreciate the committee's consideration of these changes recommended by the industry, which is significant and growing for our state. According to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, spending on activities from snow sports to fishing, hunting, camping, biking, boating, you name it, contributed $1.54 billion to Vermont's economy in 2021, ranking our state the third highest in the nation for contributions to state gross domestic product. And all of those investments trickle down to our communities, to our people, when local economies are driven by outdoor recreation. And our manufacturing and retail industries are strong and they are important for Vermont. This legislation will have consequential impacts to our businesses and employees, but they are all prepared and moving forward to remove these chemicals and comply with requirements that are put in place. And therefore, we value your thoughtful consideration on this bill, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And I do have a couple of questions, and we thank you for having all of your recommendations here and your testimonies. Terrific. So one of the recommendations is to the, make sure I don't want to get it wrong. The manufacturing piece where rather than after the effective date, wait, you're talking about, I have to find it. The manufacturer, it reads as if the manufacturer can keep manufacturing for a period of time after the effective date. There's not really a period of time for inventory to be expended, rather you keep manufacturing. And then let me find the specific comment. If someone else has a question, go ahead and ask. You probably know what I'm talking about.
Well, are you referring to a sellout window for retailers after the effective date? I see, I think I understand.
Manufacturing.
And that the manufacturing.
Here it is. It's under textile 1692A. It says textiles are an article to which PFAS have been intentionally added that were manufactured after the effective date. So suppose a manufacturer decided to build up stock before that, then all of those things would flood the market. So that would be a concern that I would have. What is your thing? I mean, can you just talk about my concern and what this language means to you? It may not be the same thing.
Yeah, yes, I think that we had asked our community about a sellout date that would be different, that would be extended from that effective date for manufacturing, so.
So you're looking for an opportunity to use up inventory before, yeah.
Right.
I think we're open to
Right.
looking at that.
Right, I
Yeah.
think we're open to, we didn't have a decision on that.
Okay.
In California, the Outdoor Industry Association did propose a full year after
Yeah, I
the
saw
effective
that,
date for
12-month period.
manufacturing.
Yeah.
And being able to sell out inventory for an additional year beyond that, so we'd be opening to pushing out a sellout date.
So is that the 2028 request or is
No,
it?
the 2028 request was specific to manufacturing for severe wet condition apparel. And 2026 was the other effective date, but if a year was added, that would be 2027 for retailers or selling inventory.
Okay, so you're just looking for some inventory placement, okay.
Yes, I think it would be appreciated by the retailers, although we can come up with a specific date to recommend, but we.
Okay, if you have something,
Okay.
let us know, and
Thank
then we'll sort through that, and I'm sure there will be other comments on this, but.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not looking for the chicken or the egg, but I am confused about, are we manufacturing these products in Vermont? Or, but you're buying the material from outside of Vermont. So I'm trying to figure out how we're gonna stop the supply stream. Even more so than how they're gonna substitute something for it. Is it, so are you saying that by extending these dates, that we're gonna be able to continue to manufacture and until that supply stream is exhausted and something replaces it?
I can't speak specifically to the production process, but I do understand the effective dates to be pushed out enough to allow that time for the transition of those production cycles. So it might take, especially for some manufacturers, up until 2026 or 2028 to complete that process. I can say that there are many manufacturers in Vermont that have production in Vermont, or they are producing part of the product. So they may be bringing in products to do part of the production process. And so I think they're looking at all of those streams in their manufacturing.
Just then one more follow-up. So in the meantime, do we know what materials have these chemicals in them? And is there anything in there about marking the material so we know what the ingredients are?
There isn't anything in here. And I know there is a labeling requirement as part of the California law, although I can't speak to it in detail for the 2028 for the severe wet conditions. So after that 2026 date, it's clear that those products that are still being manufactured do have a label to allow for that.
Just a warning label.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
But several manufacturers said that they are moving forward as fast as possible to comply with the California law. So they are hoping that the labeling is not so necessary because they're able to really make these transitions happen as soon as possible.
Well, and California represents quite a large market, so it
Yes.
does influence
Yes.
what retailers have.
And some products may be labeled for wherever they go because it's hard to just label the products going to California. So in some cases, they will just be producing labels for all of those types of products in their category.
Okay. Other questions?
Thank you.
Helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. I'll try to look at some of this. All right. Chelsea Murtha. Chelsea is on Zoom. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Do we have your testimony in writing on our webpage yet? I'm just about to look.
You don't have the testimony I'm about to deliver, but we are signed on to the letter that Kelly provided with the specific amendment recommendation.
Chelsea, your sound sounds like an echo chamber, and it's difficult to hear. It's difficult to hear. there's something that you
Is this
might.
any better?
Well, if you speak fairly
Yes,
deliberately,
no?
slowly, I think we'll be able to get through. Why don't you go ahead and introduce
Is this any
yourself?
better? I'm sorry.
Go ahead, try again.
I'm sorry, folks. Is this working now?
Yes, please. And just as long as you don't speed up too much, I think we'll be okay.
Okay, I apologize.
No, don't apologize. It's technology.
Well, thank you, Chair Lyons and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Chelsea Murtha, the Director of Sustainability at the American Apparel and Footwear Association. On behalf of AAFA, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on S25. AAFA is the National Trade Association representing apparel, footwear, and other sewn products companies and their suppliers, which compete in the global market. Representing more than 1,000 world-famous name brands, including several brands and retailers in Vermont, AAFA is the trusted public policy and political voice of the apparel and footwear industry, its management and shareholders, and its more than 3 million US workers, and its contribution of $470 billion in annual US retail sales. We approach all of our work through the lens of purpose-driven leadership in a manner that supports each member's ability to build and sustain inclusive and diverse cultures, meet and advance ESG goals, and draw upon the latest technology. With our members engaged in the production and sale of clothing and footwear, we are on the front lines of product safety. It is our members who design and execute the quality and compliance programs that stitch product safety into every garment and shoe that we make. And in fact, many of our members have already announced their intentions to phase out the use of intentionally added PFAS in their general wearing apparel in advance of the bill's 2026 deadline. And our most recent update to our open industry restricted substances list has included PFAS as a class of chemicals for general wearing apparel for the first time. AAFA and our members are proud advocates for regulatory requirements that can effectively protect human health and the environment. Regulations that are harmonized, enforceable, and science-based play a critical role in furthering our industry's efforts. And in that vein, we appreciate the committee's interest in this topic, and we have a few recommendations to make to the legislation, which are all in agreement with what Kelly just spoke to you about. So first, in Section 3, we would recommend the legislation be amended to clarify the definition of intentionally added PFAS by establishing a science-based testing threshold. We recommend this testing threshold be set at 100 parts per million total organic fluorine for our products. According to our third-party laboratory members, an 100 parts per million total organic fluorine threshold is achievable using currently available testing methods and avoids capturing inadvertent PFAS contamination from buildup in the environment. A concentration below 100 parts per million total organic fluorine would not confer any technical or functional effects in our products, and therefore there would be no point to add PFAS intentionally at such a low level. And I think to one of the members' questions earlier about what kinds of products have PFAS in this is generally actually quite well known to the industry because PFAS is used to provide certain effects like water resistance, stain resistance, oil, and chemical repellency. So it's usually well known what products are likely to contain PFAS that's been intentionally added. Further, adopting an 100 parts per million total organic fluorine threshold would align with requirements in California, such as AB 1817 and AB 652. And harmonization on this point would provide a clear and consistent and science-based target for manufacturers that will facilitate their compliance efforts. Second, we recommend delaying the effective date to January 1, 2028 for outdoor apparel for severe wet conditions. Efforts to phase out PFAS use require researching and developing potential alternative materials, evaluating those performance characteristics and consumer acceptance, ensuring that alternative materials do not have unintended impacts on workers, consumers, or the environment, and commercializing new products and transitioning existing inventory. This work is actively underway by all of our members, but more time is needed to complete this process effectively for outdoor apparel for severe wet conditions. While our members are reporting finding acceptable PFAS alternatives that provide sufficient water resistance for regular consumer products, we have yet to hear that an alternative is widely available that would provide the necessary protection required in extended and extreme wet outdoor conditions. More time is needed to complete the transition for this specific subcategory of products, and both California and New York have recognized this in their own legislation, which prohibits the use of intentionally added PFAS in apparel. So we would urge you to do the same. Third, and I know you all had some questions about this, but we are recommending the legislation include a sell-through provision, allowing companies to sell off stock manufactured before the effective date. I know there was questions about buildup of inventory, and I want to assure folks that that is absolutely not happening. Our members are actively trying to transition away from all use of intentionally added PFAS. Given other national requirements, it would be extremely unlikely and frankly imprudent to try and build up stock that uses intentionally added PFAS at this point. The reason we are recommending this is because our members are already experiencing significant inventory issues. We have, as you may recall, had significant supply chain issues during COVID, and those are still having ramifications for our industry. Several of our members have stock that is years old at this point that they're trying to figure out how to sell off and distribute. And so that is the reason we're asking for a sell-through provision, but there is no intention to continue to manufacture products with intentionally added PFAS. And then finally, we are recommending the legislation require the publication of implementing regulations 12 months in advance of the effective date. And if the final regulations are not available 12 months in advance of the effective date, we would recommend that the effective date be pushed back so that it goes into effect 12 months after final regulations are promulgated. Ideally, in this scenario, final regulations would be available January 1, 2025, and the effective date could move forward as planned. We are simply asking for this because, as Will alluded to, there have been significant issues in Maine with some of their PFAS rules and the legislation actually becoming effective before the final implementing regulations are available. And this has caused significant compliance concerns and frustration throughout our and many other industries. That is the substance of my comments. I'm happy to take more questions. Thank you. And we look forward to working more with Vermont on the regulation of substances in consumer products.
Well, Gio. Thank you. Questions? So there's some consistency between what we heard from Kelly Ault and your testimony, and that's very helpful.
Yes, we are aligned.
Good, yeah. I like alignment. This committee is all about alignment. Regardless of whether it's healthcare or chemicals. Yeah, and so one of the things that I've heard from you and from Kelly, and I think others, is the concern about the rulemaking process and when that goes into effect. And that's something that we'll have to look at. I know on LCAR, on our rules committee, we have been talking about legislative intent and how to have those rules come out in a timely fashion. And that affects not just us, but it certainly affects you. So we'll be looking at that. Senator Weeks and I are both on rules committee, so we get it.
That is gratifying to hear.
On LCAR, legislative administrative. Okay, thank you. So questions committee. Good. Lauren Hurl is here from the Vermont Conservation Voters. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today in strong support of S25 so that we can better protect Vermonters and our environment from harmful chemicals like PFAS. For the record, my name is Lauren Hurl, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters. And VCV is a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advocates for strong environmental policies. And one of our annual projects is the Environmental Common Agenda, which identifies the key environmental priorities. This year we had 19 organizations participating, and S25 was identified as a top priority of the environmental community this year. And personally, I've worked on toxic chemical reforms for more than a decade and have had the honor of working on many bills with the Vermont legislature to enact bans on harmful chemicals like flame retardants, lead, mercury, phthalates, bisphenols, and PFAS from a range of products. I served on the committee that formed after the discovery of PFAS contamination of water supplies in Bennington back in 2016. And that group really identified a whole suite of recommendations that the legislature has been working through for many years of how do we make sure that no Vermonter has contaminated water, and how do we stop upstream importation of PFAS into our state, which is a big part of what this bill does. Just yesterday, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency put out first ever federal proposed regulations for drinking water for PFAS. And this was just 6 of the thousands of PFAS chemicals. So it's a great initial step and lots more work to do. And in that announcement, they recognize that these chemicals cause a range of harms to human health, including cancer, and had a goal of essentially getting to 0 PFAS in water, that there really is no safe level of these chemicals. Meanwhile, in Vermont, we've been ahead of the curve and testing public drinking water supplies now for a couple of years. A number of communities have found it. Just earlier this week, there was a press report about in Heinsberg, they found they've started testing drinking water private wells for the first time. So they've got a program that's starting to roll out. And of course, they're starting to find it in private wells. So Heinsberg, they found some in drinking water wells that were downstream of an old closed landfill. So unfortunately, we know we're going to see more of that and are going to be dealing with the ramifications. I'm sure you all saw the story of the train that was derailed carrying toxic chemicals in Eastern Ohio, ignited this fire that coated the town. And now the residents in that community are rightly concerned about long-term impacts to their health, their soil, water, air, and they're going to be dealing with that for decades to come. And it was just a stark reminder that from every stage of the production of these toxic chemicals, you've got the workers and the communities that are hosting the factories. You then have to transport the chemicals where you've got potential harm. You then have products that we're bringing into our homes, our schools, daycares, our workplaces that have these chemicals that can cause exposure. And then we dispose of them and they continue to cause ongoing contamination issues. So the more that we can stop importing dangerous chemicals like PFAS and the chemicals in this bill, that just has ripple effects of getting us to safer products, workplaces, communities for all Vermonters. And you heard earlier about why Vermont needs to be engaged. Ideally, this would be something the federal government would be doing and we wouldn't have to worry about it. Unfortunately, the federal inaction is really well documented and the Vermont legislature has stepped up over and over again to better protect our residents from harmful chemicals. And it's really been an important and impactful approach that the state has taken, really helping drive markets to safer products. And I won't go into, again, why the Modernization of Cosmetic Regulation Act does not address the issues. Again, it was some positive steps, but it doesn't deal with restricting toxic chemicals in cosmetics, which is what this bill does. So, that's great, that should move forward. But we still need to move forward with bills like S25. You've heard that this bill really builds on the work that is happening in other states. And, in many ways, we are looking to harmonize with what's happening elsewhere. And we know that there's a lot more that needs to be done. And so, in a couple of ways, it does go beyond what other states have done. It's been brought up, like we should just harmonize with California, for example. Even there's already been a bill introduced that would expand the list of chemicals. So it's not like that is done and we're like, great, we solved cosmetics issues in California.
We did that 20 years ago.
Exactly. Earlier you heard about the chemicals of high concern to children's products list as one approach. From our mind, those chemicals have been vetted repeatedly. Our Department of Health took that list. So those are chemicals that have been identified as concerning. If you look back at that original statute, which some of us in this room have spent many, many years working on, and it required, in order to get on our list of chemicals of high concern to children, that it be demonstrated by a well-reputed governmental agency that it causes cancer or reproductive harm or similar harm to health, and it had to be demonstrated that people are being exposed to it. So there have to be some exposure pathways. Mr. Driscoll's right that bill is a reporting program. To get on the list, you do have to have demonstrated concerns. And so our Department of Health has done a lot of work kind of analyzing and documenting the harm of these chemicals. So I do think that's a reasonable place to say, these are chemicals that our state has identified as of concern. So getting them out of cosmetics, which include products that children are using, does seem rational to me. Also, that program, it does have an intention of eventually regulating products. That piece of the law has been on hold. I think that understandably, the Department of Health has had a lot on their plate the last few years. So I think some of that has gotten stalled out, but they were supposed to be going through those chemicals and proposing regulations of them. It was not just a reporting program. So just to note that. This bill, we heard a little bit about like class-based approaches, the list here and taking the class-based approach is really important for these chemicals. The Vermont legislature in 2021 enacted a law unanimously that bans the class of PFAS chemicals from food packaging, firefighting foams, key wax, and residential carpets and rugs. We can see the failure that comes from trying to name chemicals one by one. In this case, there's thousands of them. We will never stay on top of this public health threat if we try to take that approach. And other classes too, like bisphenols. The legislature acted on BPA, industry moved to BPS, which turned out to be just as harmful. So, again, we need to be looking at a class-based approach, and the Vermont legislature has taken that approach. Other states are moving in that direction. Retailers are taking that approach as well. So that is how we're going to protect public health. We talked a little bit about formaldehyde. I did want to note, and I can do some follow-up, and I believe tomorrow you're going to have a witness from the Department of Ecology in Washington State who can speak to some of the research they've been doing. But that one is really important. This is a chemical that causes leukemia, nose and throat cancer, asthma, skin irritation. Formaldehyde is on Vermont's list of chemicals of high concern to children, as it has been for many years. And putting chemicals in that are known and purposely added because they release formaldehyde. And given that there's testing showing that there are high levels in products where these chemicals are added as preservatives, really to get at formaldehyde, you have to be looking at the class. You can't just do formaldehyde itself, which is, typically not added. It is these formaldehyde releasing agents are what we're seeing. And we know they brought up contamination. There are lots of ways to preserve things. There's plenty of products that don't contain formaldehyde as well. So we think taking that approach is how we're going to protect public health. Given, and I've heard a lot of this, just a couple last thoughts. The product categories that you have here. So for personal care products, we've heard some recommendations today to harmonize with California and Maryland. Again, we really think that going beyond what has happened there is important to protect public health. Vermont has identified chemicals on this list, such as phthalates, which we banned from food packaging a couple years ago. We know that these chemicals are harmful and low quantities are harmful. We know that children are particularly vulnerable with their small bodies. Really small exposure levels can cause particular harm. So that is a real concern. And through our own chemicals of high concern to children reporting, we can see a lot of these chemicals being reported in products sold into Vermont. So we know it's happening. We know our kids are being exposed, and moving forward with restricting those is really important. In terms of the recommendations around implementation dates and that kind of thing, I guess particularly for the textiles, we're very open to aligning our law with California. I think that making sure that those dates line up. If industry is doing it for California, that's such a big market. Like, there's no reason to go later than California. But I think aligning with it does make sense. We would be the first East Coast market to do it. I think it's really important that we do have an East Coast market. We don't want to become, where as that's going into effect in California, they're sending their products over to Vermont to sell off, and then we become the dumping ground for contaminated
from products from China.
Yeah.
Similarly, yeah.
Yeah, and the EU, where they regulate many more of these chemicals. So certainly open to, appreciated, having spent done a lot of similar bills. You know, I appreciate that the industry witnesses are really coming in with, you know, some really focused recommendations around how we, you know, align with what's happening elsewhere and kind of acknowledging that these chemicals are concerning and like looking for pathways to transition. So certainly open to working with any stakeholders if that's helpful to see where, you know, because I think there's a lot of agreement overall. And, you know, for us, it's looking to expand the list of cosmetics and, you know, making sure that we're not pushing timelines out so far that any longer than necessary. You know, the more time that we're bringing these products, it's more time that we're being exposed, it's more time that the manufacturing is resulting in contamination of our environment, all of that. So we just want, you know, as quickly as is feasible and reasonable to transition to safer products for all of Vermonters is our goal. On the turf, just to wrap up, you know, we support just any step that's going to restrict PFAS chemicals. You know, the idea of you've got PFAS contaminated kind of carpets of plastic that you're putting out. We know that PFAS are incredibly persistent. That's why they're called the forever chemicals. And we know they're very mobile. So we know that, you know, it's going to be raining and snowing on those fields, and the PFAS can then get into the soil, the water. And so it's just creating an unnecessary kind of exposure. Plus you then have to throw those away eventually and figure out what to do with them. And then it gets in the waste stream. And, you know, I'm on city council here in Montpelier, and we've been dealing with, we take leachate from the landfill that has all this PFAS that we, you know, discovered and had high levels in our wastewater treatment facilities. So it's just, you see these like ramifications all over the state from having to deal with the products and then the disposal of things and then, you know, all of that. So, you know, we just support anything that's going to move away from bringing more PFAS into our state, putting it out into the environment, and having all of the downstream contamination issues.
Yeah, so there's one question about
I
that.
don't expect you to be a turf expert, but so I am really curious, are they, because I'm in the education committee
Yeah.
and a lot of schools have turfs and
Mhm.
more probably will in the future. Are they making turfs without PFAS? Is that the thing?
So my understanding is that PFAS are not intentionally added to turf. What happens is to make the little, this is the way it's been described to me, is like to make the little grass things,
Mhm.
they have to go through these, the way the manufacturer, it's like, they need to basically grease up the equipment that does it. And so it's on the equipment that it goes through so that you get that nice little like grass, like the little things. And so what they have found when they test the PFAS is that, or when they test the turf, is that they're finding PFAS into it, but the industry is like, well, we don't add any PFAS, but it's getting introduced to it through the manufacturing process. So I don't know, because they would have to like look at the manufacturing process, and is there some other, you know, material to grease the equipment or something that would not result in
The issue is that you could still have a artificial turf field if the skids aren't greased with.
Right, yeah, presumably there would be a way to produce them without. I mean, there's a whole other host of chemicals and things in turf that is another issue. I know this bill doesn't deal with it.
Yeah, I know, but it's really popular.
It is, yeah, but yeah, for the PFAS, you know, I mean, you know, and often policies like, okay, we're not going to allow PFAS in it because they're not intentionally adding it. I mean, they could look for ways to get to stop it. And like these kinds of bills have driven market shifts to, you know, identify that there's a problem and then work to solve it. And so, you know, I would hope that if this moves forward, at least we're not introducing PFAS, you know, if we're going to move forward with turf and can find ways to avoid this PFAS contamination that I don't think anybody wants. It's just,
No.
you know, it's kind of how it's.
And
laid
the
out.
report that I was indicating, it's a journalistic report about the baseball team back way back when, but now they're dying of cancer at a relatively young age, which is sad. And then there was another report out of Boston about kids' soccer team where they were experiencing some significant health risks as a result of exposure on turf. It's a problem. Go ahead.
Just a comment. Well, you know, it's not just cosmetics, it's not just clothing. It's, what about spray foam insulation that we're treating our homes with?
Yeah,
So,
that's a good question, and we have dealt with that in the past. So I don't know, Lauren, if you want to comment on
Yeah.
that.
I mean, It's a great question. You know, so some states have started approaches, like Maine actually took, instead of doing this category by category approach, they put a law in that basically had a presumption of like, you need to demonstrate to us that this is an essential use, that, you know, there's no alternative that we can be using that doesn't have this chemical. Because there's applications like medical devices and other things that, and so, I mean, they're in the process of trying to figure out how to implement it, which is a big, meaty program, as you can imagine. You know, we've kind of viewed it as like, that is happening in parallel, and it means that they're not, in the meantime, just moving more quickly on banning chemicals. It's like a 2030 timeline, something in that ballpark. And so, you know, I think that is going to be happening, and like we'll certainly be keeping an eye on like, okay, what are the other product classes, and what Vermont's done from S20 a couple of years ago, and this bill is really looking at some analyses of like, what are the biggest uses of these, and where, you know, what are some of like the big volume and exposure pathways, and so trying to go through those, but that work is happening, and the EU has been moving forward with much broader PFAS bans, and so I think the market transition and the search for how do we get out of using these chemicals more broadly is underway globally as well. But yeah, it's a great question and really important.
There's a bill for you to explore.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously. But, we've been through this a little bit, but yeah, this is, it's
It's like
not
you can't go to the
here.
box.
Yeah, it's hard. And
There's
some
a
of
big
the,
Pushed in, so you're-
Yeah. some of those things are sealed and sequestered, so it's not exposed to leaching. But when you have renovation or take a building down, then where do you send all of this to go to which landfill does it go to? So that's when it becomes an issue. We have talked about that.
We don't manufacture anything here in the United States anymore. It all comes from China.
A lot of it
Yeah,
does.
so it comes from the west to the east,
Yeah,
through California.
yeah. So California is the buffer. Anything else? You were,
No,
Oh.
that, you know, I mean, just, we support the bill again. I think, you know, happy to look specifically at the proposals that have been brought forward from some of the industry groups. I think, you know, again, aligning with California on the textiles piece for the dates makes sense. I would support that and can certainly look at specific language in that vein.
it would be helpful for you to reach out and work with folks who have testified, and maybe some language we can have Katie put together for us, because we're at that stage.
Yeah.
And we're really at the end.
Yeah.
And we're hearing more testimony tomorrow. Then we'll be putting it together. So any help that you can provide would be great. And I think that the date change is pretty realistic based on what we're hearing.
Yeah, but, you know, really important. I've worked with, you know, communities impacted by PFAS contamination, and, you know, it's just devastating what these chemicals are doing to our communities. And so this is just really excited. You all are taking this up and working on this important issue.
Yes, good. Well, COVID has gotten in the way, and we've had other pressing things, demands on us, but this one is also important. So, committee, I think, golly. S36 is Eric. Is what I'm gonna suggest is we take a 15-minute break. Right now, it's only 10:30.
I've got something at 11:45. Is there
I know, I'm
anything?
gonna try to, that's why I just asked if Eric might be available
Yeah, that'd be
in
great.
15 minutes.
Yeah,
Then we can look at 36.
okay.
And then we'll be online on target.
The earlier start is tough right after the clock change.